Hello, everyone. We are discussing Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God. Aquinas, again, sees himself as a scientist. He's just investigating reality using his reason and his senses to try to describe reality in the most intelligible way. And for Aquinas, God is a theoretical postulate. It is the being that is postulated by reason as a way of making intelligible or of explaining reality as delivered by the senses. And that just is science. He defines science very broadly. It is not an interesting question whether or not he has the right conception of science. Contemporary scientists might have a significantly more precise account of the nature of science. But Aquinas is very aware that the kind of thing he's doing is not like physics or biology. He thought that biology was a particular kind of science. Physics was a different kind of science. And the kind of thing he's doing here is something like metaphysics. It's a different kind of branch of knowledge. But it doesn't really matter whether, it's not an interesting question whether the kinds of things Aquinas is doing that's reaching God is science or not. Is that the right way of labeling? What matters is whether or not his conclusions are correct, whether or not he's using reason adequately. Those are the real questions. Those are the real questions for our purposes, not how to label them. And again, Aquinas thinks if you want to investigate reality, investigate the truth, you use your reason, use your senses, and then God becomes the postulate, the reason for making things intelligible or explainable. Here's the picture again of the earth being held up by turtles. And this is an actual historical thing. People talked about this, but it's also symbolic of a kind of way of thinking, way of arguing, way of trying to understand what counts as a satisfactory answer to a question. There's a question, why is something the way it is? And then an answer is put forth, and the question becomes, is the answer satisfactory? Or does the answer that is put forth as an explanation, is itself in need of explanation? In this series of turtles holding up the earth is a very good example of that. There's the question about why the earth is not falling. And there are different stories that you can have. The current story does not postulate other physical things holding it up. And we find it very satisfying, partly because of that. We do not put forth another thing that's holding it up. But if you do, if you think that what explains the earth not falling is this other physical thing that is holding it up, much like my pen does not fall because it's sitting on top of my desk, it is my desk being a physical thing that's holding it up. If you think that's the right application of physical concepts onto the earth, then you're going to ask, well, what is this thing that is holding up the earth? And if you think it's a turtle, you're going to ask about that turtle. Is that turtle also subject to the same kinds of question? Why is it not falling? And then there's a postulation of something else, another turtle, and so on. And once you have this series of this chain of beings providing explanations, once you have this chain, the next question is the chain infinite? Does it have an end? Does it end with something that explains the chain itself, and that is itself not in need of further explanation? And that's a very interesting question. And that's the kind of question that Aquinas asks, not about the earth and turtles, but about coming into existence of motion in general. If you see something come into existence, you ask what brought it into existence and what brought that into existence, what brought that into existence, pointing at the different chains in the link. And at the heart of his main argument for God is that the series cannot be infinite. And last time we saw that as a premise in an argument. And I give you some reasons for thinking that the premise was plausible, was credible, was reasonable. But here's an actual argument whose conclusion is the premise. So it's a argument for the premise 6, which states that the infinite series of movers cannot be infinite. The infinite series of things in the chain that explain other things in the chain cannot go on forever. If it goes on forever, there's no legitimate explanation. So here's that argument. First, and this is the main premise, it's a claim about a principle about the nature of change in general. It's a principle about how motion happens or can happen, a condition for the intelligibility of change. And here's what it says. Change in general or motion must involve a principal mover, which is the source, the origin of the motion, the thing that explains the motion. That's the principal mover, the one that explains motion. Perhaps sometimes instrumental movers, that is things or links in the series of chains, the chain of explanation that the principal mover utilizes. It's an instrument used by the mover to bring about the motion or the change. In a moved, a thing that is being changed. So all change involves a principal mover, the one initiating the change. I moved a thing that is changed and the thing that undergoes change. And sometimes that involves intermediary links that the mover, the principal mover uses to change, to bring about the change. So here are a couple of examples. Let's talk about the chalk example. Suppose I'm teaching a philosophy class, you come to my philosophy class, you're in the classroom, and then I go to the board and write down A equals A. I use the chalk and write it down. And then I make a point about the intellect being able to grasp a necessary truth, and that how that intellect is different from the mere sensation. Someone who does not know how to read would be able to read, to see the A equals A in the board, but they would not be able to grasp the necessary truth that all objects are self-identical. Someone who can read is able to engage, reason, and grasp that truth, right? Suppose I make that point. And the class continues and the class ends, and then you stay there taking notes talking to a friend. Another friend of yours walks into the room, looks up at the board. A friend of yours who was not in the class looks up at the board and sees A equals A. And he thought, oh, is this a math class? What's about that? And he asks you, why is there those scribbles, that thing in the board? Why is the A equals A thing in the board, right? That's the question. There is something given to the senses, the phenomena, words written in the board. And there's a question. What explains that? Why is it that the thing is there? What's the cause? What's the origin? Now, there's several things you can say, right? You can say something, you can point to things like, oh, well, there's the chalk, and if you see it there, it's by the board as well. And the chalk moved in a particular pattern such, and it was, against the board, and moving a particular pattern left some residue behind the white thing you're seeing there. And it was, moved in this particular pattern such that A equals A was left there, right? That's the first link in the chain of explanation. If you were to tell that to your friend might look at you and think, well, I knew that. Like that's not what I asked, right? I assumed that came about by, a chalk being moved in a particular way. It might be part of the explanation, but you haven't answered my question, why is that there? And then if you say, oh, fair enough, I'll give you another link in the chain. There was a hand, and the hand was holding the chalk, and the hand was moving in this particular way, such that by moving it, it was pressing the chalk against the board and so on. So you have another link in the chain. Now the hand is causing or moving the chalk, which is itself causing or moving, bringing about the change in the board. But of course, your friend is not going to be very impressed, right? He's going to say, okay, fair enough, that's another link in the chain, but why is why is the thing in the board? Why is the A equals A in the board? You haven't yet explained that, even though you're pointing to causes, links in the chain. And if you point to the arm, he's also not going to be impressed, right? What is it that is going to satisfy the curiosity of your friend? When you say something like, oh, I was taking a philosophy class, there was this professor who was here, and he was making a point about the way in which the senses capture information for us, in the way in which the intellect engages with that information and sees past, or it's the kind of faculty that we have to go to see beyond that which is given by the senses, to see necessary truths, which are not just the senses, but are represented by the thing in the senses. If you say something like that, then your friend's going to say, oh, that's cool. Like, now I get it. Now I know why A equals A is there. Something different happened here. You did not just point to a link in the chain of things that themselves required explanations, the hand, the chalk, the arm, but rather you point to a different kind of thing, a thing that explains the motion. You pointed to a principal mover that originated, that started the chain. And it started the chain in such a way that now I understand why it is the thing is on the board. So pointing to the chalk or the hand is just a different kind of thing than it is to point into the principal mover, in this case, the professor trying to make a philosophical point. Your friend would now understand why the thing is on the board. He might also have all sorts of questions, like, who's this professor? How tall is he? Is it a he? What class was it? He might have a lot of questions. But not any longer directly pertaining to the existence of that thing, right? There's this like large nexus of causes that is going on, But the answer to his first question, why is that thing in the board, will be, more or less satisfied, will be finished. That's one example. Here's a different example. Suppose you're, wake up one day and then you realize you're in a cart in the train, in the trail tracks, rail tracks. And you look out the window and you see that you're moving, right? Your cart is moving. And then you look around the cart and it's just this box, and it doesn't have the capacity for self-motion. It is in need of explanation. Something else must move it. It does not move itself. So you do not understand. You're like, why is it that we're moving if we're in this cart that is itself incapable of motion? And then you look across and there's a philosopher there. There's someone who has answers to your questions, or at least wants to know answers to these kinds of questions. And you say, hey, do you know why we're moving? And this person might say, well, I do. I actually have an answer to your question. I know why it is that we're moving, the thing given by your senses. It turns out our cart is attached to another cart in front of us. And that other cart is moving. So as it's moving, it's dragging us. And the motion of the cart to which we're attached is explaining our motion. So your response, if you're reasonable, would be something like, oh, cool, that's a step in the right direction. You're trying to explain things. But tell me more about this cart. Is this cart like this one, that it's itself also not capable of motion by itself, like not self-motion? If it is this way, then what's moving it? You think that you've not been given an answer to your question, why are we moving, by merely citing another cart. And suppose your friend says, oh yeah, you're right, the other cart is also not moving itself. It's itself being moved by something else. But hey, have an answer to that too. The second cart is attached to another cart, which is in motion, and because it's attached to the second cart, it's dragging it, and it's dragging us. And then, of course, you're not going to be super satisfied. You can say, okay, fair enough. But if that third cart is also like this one that doesn't explain its own motion, why are we moving? We've not answered the question, why are you moving? So you might just say, well, let me just cut to the chase of it. Is there something in front that is dragging us? Now there are two different ways of answering that question. One can be, oh no, there's just carts all the way. They're just one cart in front of another cart, 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 infinitely. That's one possibility. A second one is, oh no, at some point you reach a motor cart, something that has a motor, and that motor is what makes it move. And by it moving, it moves the rest. So there's a different kind of thing that is explaining the motion. And here's what Aquinas is saying. Unless that is what's going on, there is yet any actual explanation for why you're moving. If your philosopher sitting across the cart is telling you, oh no, there's just another cart, he hasn't yet answered your question. Why are you moving? If you just have an infinite series of carts, why are they not stationary carts? Why are they moving? There is no answer to your question yet. It's not until you hit something like, oh, a locomotive kind of unit that has a motive that can explain its own motion, that is not in need of further explanation, that you finally know, oh, that's why I'm moving. So that's the basic principle here. And now the rest just follows very quickly, very smoothly. That which moves instrumentally cannot move unless it is moved principally. A cart cannot move another cart unless it's attached to something that it's moving it. And likewise for all motion. The chalk cannot write on the board unless it is being moved to do so by something like a professor, something that explains its own motion. Premise number 3, if the series of movers is infinite, there would be only infinite movers. If there are turtles all the way down, at every link in the chain, there are only things that are themselves in need of further explanation. If there are just carts in this long chain, at every link in the chain, there are just things that are in further need of explanation. In Aquinas things, therefore you haven't yet explained why we're moving in the cart, or therefore you haven't yet explained why the earth is not falling, and so on. Or going back to the example I used, therefore you haven't yet explained why it is that I came into existence. Unless you reach a principal mover capable of explaining the chain of motions, your account is not intelligible yet. It's not sufficient. You've given up on intelligibility or explanation of reality. Your conception of reality is not intelligible. But now we have a conclusion. Therefore, if the series of movers is infinite, there would be no motion. But hey, there is motion, right? That's the starting point of the senses. The senses give us change. We see change. That's a hook onto reality or senses, and what we see is that things change. Things are in motion. So it cannot be, right? This is a valid argument. It cannot be that the series is infinite. Why? Because it would be infinite. There would be no motion, and there's motion. So therefore, the series of movers cannot be infinite. The series of entities postulated to explain the observable phenomena cannot themselves be an infinite series of things or entities that are stand in need of explanation. And that just is the premise that we needed for the previous argument. Let's also look at another argument. This is the argument from contingency, or the third way. And it looks in several regards similar to the first way, especially if you read the first way like I've been doing in terms of bringing into existence. But it's a different one. There are different premises here. So here's what the argument says. We find in nature things that are contingent. Again, things we see, right? We see clouds. They come into and out of existence. Everything that is given by the senses are particulars. They're instances of things, right? They're things that need not be there. I see tables, I see chairs, I see clouds, I see buildings, I see rocks. And everything I see is such that it is possible for it not to be there. They are contingent. Their existence is contingent. Everything given by the senses is a contingent existence. Premise number two is also one of those sciencey kind of claims. It connects the observation about the possibility of non-existence, or the contingency of things that we see, with time. And it says that which is possible for it not to exist, at one time it's not. So it says that for something to count legitimately as possible, it must be the kind of thing that, given enough trials, it will happen. So think of Murphy's Law. It smells like Murphy's Law, right? Everything that can happen at some point, given enough trials, will happen. And kind of the converse of that is something like, well, if something will not happen, regardless of how many times you try, you can keep trying over and over and over again, and it will never happen, then that's not really possible. What it is for something to be possible is for it to happen at some time if you keep trying over. It might take many, many, many trials, but if it's possible at some time, it will happen. That's Murphy's Law. That's kind of what's happening here in premise number two. So going back to things, everything you see is such that it's possible for it not to exist. Given premise number two, it says there is a time in which the thing is not, either in the past or in the future, but there's a time in which the thing does not exist. Why? Because it is the kind of thing that is possible for it not to exist. And given enough trials, given enough times, what is possible will happen. And it's possible for those things not to exist. So what you see will fade, will die or disappear at some point in the future, or it was not there sometime in the past, or both. Now three is like two, but it's broader. It applies to everything, every physical thing, every kind of thing that is observable, things you can see. If everything that you see were contingent, then at one time nothing would exist. If everything in the world were the kind of thing that is possible for it not to exist, then at one time it would not exist. So that, again, that's just like Murphy's Law, but applied to the whole thing. If you have this collection of things, each of which is possible for it not to be, then at one point, one of the possibilities is that the whole collection will not exist at some point. And given enough trials, that will come about because it's possible. Now, if we assume that the past is infinite, we assume that we've been here for a long time, then there was a point in time in the past in which this happened. At one point in the past, assuming that the past is infinite, nothing was existing. Why? Because one of the possibilities, if everything's contingent, is that nothing exists. If that were the case in the past, then there would be nothing now, because from nothing, nothing comes. Now, 4 presupposes that the past is infinite, that there's an infinite chain in the back. You might think, hey, wait a minute, didn't we spend a long time trying to argue that that's not the case? And Aquinas will say, well, yeah, if you think that the previous argument that argues that the past cannot be infinite, fails, this argument, the argument from contingency, still goes through. So the argument from contingency presupposes that the past is infinite. If you think that the past is finite, that there's a beginning, then that's just is the first argument. So you can think of the first way and the third way as a very long argument, and it says either the past is infinite, there's an infinite series of chains in the back, and that then you go with one argument, or it's not, and then you go with the other argument. But you can just combine them, and they exhaust all of the options. So Aquinas will say so much the stronger for my arguments because it captures all of the possibilities. But here's what follows. Therefore, it is not the case that everything is contingent. Something must be necessary. Why? Because there is something now. If everything were contingent, there would be a time in which nothing existed, given enough time. If nothing exists, then nothing will follow because nothing comes from nothing. There wouldn't be any existing being at some point. Once we hit the, nothing exists, then that's it. Nothingness from now onward, assuming that everything is contingent. But hey, there's stuff here. If we assume the past is infinite, we wouldn't have stuff here. There wouldn't be things that are contingent here, unless there's a necessary being that is holding things in existence, unless there's a necessary being that is explaining the existence of merely contingent beings. Otherwise, if they're merely contingents, at some point will cease to exist. Okay, so there are several other arguments. Let's stop here, though. I will see you next time.